The night air outside the grand hall was thick with excitement and the faint scent of popcorn and spilled beer. Inside, the comedy festival had drawn a crowd that seemed to pulse with energy, a living, breathing organism hungry for laughter. Max Tanner stood in the wings, eyes darting over the sea of faces that stretched back into the dimly lit cavern of the auditorium. The stage lights bathed the polished wooden platform in a warm, golden glow, a stark contrast to the cold dread coiling in Max's gut. He adjusted the microphone stand nervously, his fingers trembling slightly despite the practiced smile plastered on his face. The cursed joke book, heavy and ominous, rested in the inner pocket of his jacket's secret weight that both empowered and terrified him. Tonight was no ordinary show. Every chuckle, every guffaw carried a shadow, a risk that lurked just beneath the surface of the humor. Backstage, Lila Nguyen paced with a sharp eye on the entrance. Her stylish attire and confident smirk belied the tightness in her jaw. Beside her, Detective Reed leaned against the wall, his rumpled trench coat hanging loose, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. His cynical gaze swept the crowd, noting exits, potential threats, and the subtle movements of suspicious figures. Their quiet conversation was punctuated by urgent whispers and furtive glances. "They're here," Lila said, her voice low but steady. "I can feel it. The assassins won't let this night pass quietly." Reed nodded grimly. "We need to keep Max safe and find out who's backing them. This cabal supporting the Jester has deeper roots than we thought." The hall's murmur swelled into a crescendo as the host announced Max Tanner's name. The spotlight snapped on, and Max stepped into its embrace. The audience erupted in applause, a tidal wave of sound that washed over him, momentarily drowning his fears. He cleared his throat, the microphone capturing the subtle rasp. "Good evening, everyone," Max began, voice cracking just enough to sound endearing rather than nervous. "I'm Max Tanner, and I promise you, tonight's jokes might just kill you. Metaphorically, of course. Unless, of course, you're reading from a cursed joke book like me. Then, well," he forced a smile, the irony bitter in his mouth. Laughter rippled through the crowd, some chuckles, hesitant, others gleefully uninhibited. But in the back rows, shadows shifted. Figures cloaked in nondescript clothing sat with unnatural stillness, eyes cold and calculating. Among them, Evelyn Cross, the assassin leader, scanned the stage with lethal precision, her every movement a silent threat. Max launched into his routine, weaving the cursed jokes with his own dry wit and self-deprecating humor. The audience responded with uproarious laughter, a sound both joyous and chilling. Each joke seemed to push the boundaries of normalcy, the laughter ballooning into something uncontrollable, almost manic. Behind the scenes, Lila and Reed exchanged nods, their covert security measures in motion. Reed's phone buzzed quietly. A message from an informant hinted at a planned attack during Max's climax. Time was slipping away. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently. A murmur swept through the crowd as the hall was plunged into darkness. Panic threatened to erupt, but emergency lights sputtered on, casting eerie red and blue glows across the stunned faces. On the edge of the stage, the silhouette of the Jester emerged, his tattered costume and painted grin stark against the dim light. His eyes gleamed with malevolent mirth, promising chaos and calamity. The audience's laughter froze, replaced by gasps and whispers. Max's heart hammered, but his voice found strength. "Well, folks, it seems the party's just getting started." Behind him, a scuffle broke out as Lila and Reed moved swiftly to intercept the assassins. The tension snapped, a terrifying dance of survival and wit unfolding under the watchful eyes of an audience caught between amusement and horror. This was no ordinary comedy night. This was the opening act in a deadly game where laughter was both weapon and shield, and Max Tanner was the reluctant star. As the first blows were exchanged in the shadows and the crowd's reactions teetered between hysteria and disbelief, Max realized that every joke he told could be his last. Yet, in that precarious balance, he found a strange clarity. Humor, he thought, was never just about laughs, it was about fighting back, about carving meaning out of chaos. And tonight, Max was determined to fight with every punchline he had. To be continued. The room was packed, the air thick with the scent of spilled beer and nervous anticipation. Max Tanner stepped onto the stage, the familiar spotlight washing over his slightly disheveled form like a harsh interrogation lamp. His tired eyes scanned the sea of faces, a nervous smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Tonight was supposed to be just another gig, another chance to claw his way back into the limelight. But the cursed joke book nestled in his back pocket whispered otherwise. He flipped it open briefly, fingers trembling as he chose the next joke. It was a risky one, the kind that made his throat tighten with a mix of excitement and dread. Taking a deep breath, Max launched into the punchline. The effect was instantaneous. Laughter burst out like a tidal wave, uncontrollable and manic. Faces twisted in delight and horror as the audience erupted. The sound was intoxicating, yet beneath it lay an eerie undertone, violent intensity that gnawed at Max's nerves. "Have you ever noticed," Max quipped, voice steady despite the chaos, "that the only thing worse than a bad joke is a bad joke that kills?" The crowd laughed harder, some clutching their sides, others gasping as their laughter became ragged, their bodies betraying them. Max's heart pounded. This wasn't normal. He had seen the news reports, the strange deaths linked to the cursed book, but witnessing the carnage firsthand was something else entirely. The surreal horror was painted in broad strokes of absurdity. Backstage, Lila Nguyen watched with sharp eyes, her confident smirk replaced by a frown of concern. She shuffled through the emergency kit she had insisted on bringing, preparing for the inevitable. The staff hustled to assist those collapsing, the club transforming from a venue of laughter to an impromptu triage center. "Max, you need to stop," Lila called through the comms, urgency threading her voice. "This is getting out of hand." Max shook his head, wiping sweat from his brow. "Can't stop now. They want the show, and I'm the only one who can give it to them." Detective Reed leaned against a shadowed wall, cigarette smoke curling around him like a ghostly veil. His cynical gaze swept the room, noting the chaos with growing unease. He had been tracking these deaths for weeks, a trail that led straight to Max Tanner and his cursed repertoire. The humor was a weapon now, and the wielder was dangerously close to losing control. And then came the assassins. Evelyn Cross slipped through the panicked crowd with lethal grace, her steely eyes fixed on Max. The contrast between her cold efficiency and the absurd uproar around her was stark, a predator in a den of chaos. Max caught sight of her, an icy shiver crawling down his spine despite the sweat and adrenaline flooding his veins. Improvisation became survival. Max twisted his jokes, weaving humor with desperate wit, ducking behind props, and using the laughter as a shield and a weapon. Each punchline was a calculated risk, a gamble that could mean life or death. The audience was both his danger and his salvation, their hysterics masking his movements, their gasps and guffaws echoing like battle cries. Lila coordinated from backstage, her voice steady despite the turmoil. "Left flank, to down. Keep moving, Max." Detective Reed moved through the crowd, his trench coat snagging on overturned chairs, eyes sharp for any sign of the assassins. His dry humor had abandoned him. This was no joke anymore. The battle was surreal. Laughter mingled with screams, jokes collided with gunfire, and Max found himself at the center of a maelstrom where comedy was both salvation and executioner. The cursed book hummed in his pocket, a dark promise of more deadly punchlines yet to come. As the chaos reached its crescendo, Max's mind raced. He needed a way out, a way to turn the tide. The absurdity of the situation was almost laughable if it weren't so deadly. What's the deal with assassins and comedy clubs? He muttered under his breath, eyes darting for an opening. They never laugh at the punchline. A moment of levity in the madness. But the next joke had to be the right one, the one that would buy him time. Disarm the threat, and maybe, just maybe, keep the laughter alive without death trailing behind it. The room held its breath, the deadly dance of humor and danger far from over. Max Tanner was about to find out if laughter really was the best medicine or the deadliest curse. Max's voice rose above the cacophony, weaving a tapestry of twisted humor and sharp wit. Each joke was a calculated dart, aimed not just at eliciting laughter, but at confusing, disarming, and delaying the assassins closing in. The audience, caught between hysteria and horror, became his unwitting shield. Why don't assassins ever tell jokes? Max quipped, ducking a swift movement from Evelyn Cross. Because timing is everything, and they're terrible at punchlines. A ripple of nervous laughter cut through the tension, a fragile thread of normalcy in the chaos. Lila's voice crackled in his earpiece. Keep it up, Max. We're working on a way in. Detective Reed is clearing a path. The detective's figure emerged through the smoke and scattered chairs, signaling a route. Max darted, heart hammering, adrenaline a roaring tide. But Evelyn was relentless, her cold efficiency undeterred by the madness. She closed in, a viper poised to strike, her eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. Max pivoted, grabbing a mic stand and swinging it like a makeshift weapon. The absurdity of brawling with an assassin amidst a crowd convulsing with lethal laughter was not lost on him. He grinned nervously, shouting over the din, "Comedy is all about timing, guess. I'm just a little off tonight." The clash was brief but fierce, Max's quick thinking and desperate improvisation buying precious seconds. Lila and Detective Reed converged, subduing Evelyn just as she lunged again. The room began to settle, the deadly laughter easing to a shaky murmur. Max stood breathless, the cursed joke book still burning a metaphorical hole in his pocket. "We're not out of the woods yet," Lila said, eyes scanning the crowd for signs of more danger. Detective Reed nodded grimly. "This curse, it's bigger than any of us imagined, but tonight you survived. That's something." Max's smile was weary but genuine. "Yeah, survived by the skin of my punchlines." The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. Comedy had saved him and nearly killed him in the same breath. And as the night wore on, Max knew one thing for certain: the deadly dance of laughter and danger was far from over. With a final glance at the cursed book, Max prepared for whatever punchline fate had in store next. The auditorium was a kaleidoscope of swirling neon lights and anxious faces, a surreal carnival of expectancy and dread. Max Tanner stood behind the microphone, the familiar weight of the stand-up spot suddenly heavy as a storm cloud. The crowd's laughter had been replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the faint hum of electricity in the air. And then, as if summoned by the collective heartbeat of the room, the Jester appeared. He was a violent splash of color against the dimness, tattered Jester garb, rippling unnaturally. Face painted with that eternal, sinister grin that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of human expression. His eyes gleamed with malevolent mirth, scanning the audience with an unsettling mix of amusement and menace. The laughter that erupted was not from the crowd, but from the jester himself, a chilling cackle that echoed through the auditorium like a dark spell. Max swallowed hard, his mind racing. This was no ordinary opponent. This was the embodiment of trickster fate, a force that twisted reality and jest into weapons. But Max was no longer the trembling comic who found the cursed joke book in an old antique shop. Tonight, he was a survivor, a fighter armed with wit and desperation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Max began, his voice steadier than he felt, "welcome to the worst comedy festival in the multiverse." The jester's grin widened, and he stepped forward, voice dripping with mockery. "Ah, Max Tanner, the hapless harlequin. Do you really think you can out-joke fate itself?" The stage became their battleground. Each joke, each pun was a volley, each punchline a parry. The jester's words twisted and curled like smoke, dark riddles and barbed humor that made the very air shimmer with danger. Max countered with sharp, observational humor, turning the absurdity of their situation into a weapon that cut through the jester's malevolence. Around them, the audience was caught in a hypnotic trance, their faces flickering between amusement and terror. Lila stood at the wings, her eyes sharp, signaling to Detective Reed. The detective's rumpled trench coat moved with determined purpose as he coordinated with Lila, watching for the assassins led by Evelyn Cross closing in like predators. The jester's laughter rose, a crescendo of chaotic delight. "You think you can control the punchline, control the fate woven into every jest?" Max's reply was a grin of his own, nervous but defiant. "Maybe not, but I can sure try to write my own ending." The duel escalated, words flying faster, sharper. The jester tossed out twisted jokes that bent reality, a chair that vanished mid-laugh, the spotlight flickering like a heartbeat. Max adapted, weaving his humor with quick-thinking agility, turning each bizarre moment into a laugh that was both a shield and a sword. Suddenly, from the shadows, Evelyn and her assassins surged forward, but Lila and Detective Reed were ready. A brief but fierce scuffle erupted, the tension of the verbal duel mirrored by the physical battle backstage. The chaos spilled into the auditorium, but the crowd remained entranced, caught between laughter and fear. In the midst of the turmoil, Max found his moment. With a deep breath, he delivered a pun so absurd, so utterly unexpected that it cut through the darkness like a lightning bolt. The jester staggered, his painted grin faltering, eyes wide with something close to genuine surprise. Why don't skeletons ever go to comedy clubs? Because they don't have the guts. The room held its breath as the words hung in the air. Then, a ripple of laughter, not the deadly kind, but genuine, light-hearted laughter, spread like wildfire. The surreal atmosphere crackled with the electric shock of the punchline's power, a momentary triumph of absurdity over malevolence. The jester recoiled, momentarily unmasked as a mere shadow of chaos. Max knew this was only the beginning, but for the first time, he felt the scales tipping in his favor. The battle was far from over, but he had found a way to fight fate with laughter. And as the applause began to build, the uneasy alliance of allies regrouped, preparing for the final moves in this deadly game of jokes and survival. The showdown was not just a contest of humor, but a reckoning with the very nature of fate and control, where every laugh could be the last or the salvation. Max glanced at Lila, then at Detective Reed, and finally back at the fading figure of the jester. "Ready for the next act," he whispered. The absurd dance of comedy and catastrophe was far from over. But tonight, Max Tanner had taken the stage and faced the trickster, and he was still standing. The air in the grand hall was thick with anticipation, charged by the lingering echoes of maniacal laughter and the sharp scent of sweat and fear. Max Tanner stood center stage beneath a lonely spotlight, the cursed joke book closed and resting on the microphone stand beside him like a sleeping beast. Every eye in the packed theater was locked on him, every breath held captive by the weight of the moment. No one dared to blink. Max's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic percussion that threatened to drown his thoughts. The cacophony of past performances, some joyous, others deadly, reverberated in his mind. He glanced toward the wings, where Lila stood, her smirk tempered by concern and Detective Reed. Cigarette dangling forgotten between fingers, eyes narrowed but hopeful. Behind them, the shadows twisted slightly, and there the unmistakable silhouette of the Jester lurked, his tattered costume blending with the darkness, his painted grin a cruel slash of white in the gloom. "All right," Max murmured to himself, voice barely above a whisper. "Time to end this." He stepped forward, feeling the weight of every soul in the room pressing down, the invisible threads of fate tightening around him like a noose. The cursed book had brought him here, had shaped this final act of deadly comedy. But tonight, Max was no longer the desperate comic seeking laughs at any cost. He was a survivor, a trickster in his own right, ready to wrestle the curse back. Clearing his throat, Max addressed the hushed crowd. "You know," he began, voice steady, despite the storm raging within, "they say laughter is the best medicine. But I guess, if you're not careful, it can also be the worst poison." A ripple of nervous chuckles rolled through the audience, broken by the sudden appearance of the Jester at the edge of the stage. The sinister figure's eyes gleamed with malevolent mirth, his grin wider than ever. "You think you can outwit fate, Max Tanner?" the Jester hissed, voice dripping with mockery. "This curse is older than time, and just as relentless." Max swallowed past a dry throat, then launched into the punchline he had crafted in the darkest hours of his ordeal, a joke that twisted the very essence of the curse. "But maybe," he said, eyes locking with the Jester's, "the best cure is a punchline that nobody sees coming." The room held its breath. Then the laughter began, not the wild, uncontrollable laughter that had spelled doom before, but a gentle, genuine chuckle that spread like wildfire. Faces that had been tense with fear softened, smiles breaking out spontaneously. The cursed book trembled on the stand, pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze, then suddenly snapped shut with a definitive thud. The Jester staggered back, his grin faltering into a grimace of disbelief and fury. "No," he snarled, the shadows around him flickering and shrinking as if retreating from the light. Lila exhaled sharply, stepping forward. "Looks like you just wrote your own punchline, Jester." Detective Reed cracked a rare smile, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Well, I'll be." Max allowed himself a weary grin. The curse was broken. The deadly jokes had transformed into harmless humor, the lethal edge dulled by the absurd twist of his final line. The festival erupted into applause, genuine and untainted, as the audience rose to their feet, a wave of relief washing over everyone. Behind the scenes, alliances shifted. Max felt the heavy burden of his journey lighten, replaced by a new understanding of the unpredictable nature of fate and comedy. He was no longer merely a victim or a pawn. He was a player in the grand game of absurdity, wielding humor as both shield and sword. As the lights dimmed and the crowd began to disperse, Max caught Lila's eye. "So," he said with a tired but triumphant smile, "think I've earned my spot back on the stage." She laughed softly, the sound warm and real. "You never lost it, Max. You just had to survive the joke first. Outside, the night air was crisp and clear, unburdened by the weight of curses or dark fate. Max looked up at the stars, their distant twinkle reminding him that even in the darkest moments, there was always room for light and laughter. But as he turned to leave, a faint shimmer caught his eye. Somewhere in the shadows, a sly chuckle echoed a reminder that in the world of comedy and fate, the final laugh might never truly be his. The curtain fell on the deadly joke, but the story, like all good comedy, promised more twists yet to come. The auditorium had settled into an almost eerie calm. The once raucous crowd, the chaos of uncontrollable laughter and narrow escapes, had given way to a quiet that felt almost sacred. Amber stage lights cast a gentle glow over the empty seats, shadows stretching like tired limbs across the worn floorboards. Max Tanner stood center stage, hands loosely in his pockets, his gaze drifting over the sea of vacant chairs, as if trying to imprint the moment, the calm after the storm. It was hard to believe that only hours ago, the festival had been a battleground. The deadly curse that had threatened to turn every punchline into a fatal blow was finally broken. The absurd twist that transformed lethal jokes into harmless humor felt like a cruel joke played on reality itself, but one Max was grateful for. His breath came steady now, no longer hitching with the remnants of fear. The weight on his shoulders had lifted, though the memories clung like a shadow at his back. He thought of the faces lost to laughter, the frantic moments of improvisation, the sharp sting of betrayal and trust intertwined. Comedy, he realized, was a delicate dance between light and dark, and had been waltzing on a knife's edge. Backstage, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and sweat, mingling with the faint aroma of cigarette smoke. Lila leaned against a cluttered table, arms crossed but eyes bright with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Detective Reed stood nearby, trench coat still rumpled, a cigarette perched between his fingers, though unlit. The tension that had once bristled between them had softened, replaced by something resembling understanding. "You did good, Max," Lila